This video describes and demonstrates NVivo Analysis Project 3 for EDF 6479 Qualitative Data Analysis. This project is an expansion of Projects 1 and 2, and you should continue working in the same file. Before I describe the elements of Project 3, I want to revisit an idea from earlier in the semester. In the first video of the semester, I compared qualitative research to cooking a great meal. To make a really great meal, you need quality ingredients, or solid inputs, and a chef who spent time in the kitchen developing their skill set and practicing cooking. Similarly, creating a quality research project requires having strong inputs and a researcher who has spent time practicing their skill set and thinking deeply about their content and process. As you shift into the final analysis project, I hope you will be able to see the importance of each step in the process, how you set up your folder structure, how you code your data, the quality of your memos, and how you classify and categorize your data enables you to run queries, supports the development of maps, and helps you combine all the information to answer your research question. As I said at the beginning of the semester, NVivo is not analyzing the data for you. NVivo will only do what you tell it to do, and it can only create queries and maps out of the information you've coded. In Project 3, you will continue the iterative process of analyzing your data through coding, writing memos, and creating visuals, ask questions of your data using queries, create visuals from your data using maps, and reflect on the content and process. Queries allow you to ask questions of your data so you can explore ideas or investigate hunches. The most important element of running queries is asking good questions of your data. You are the expert in your project, so it's important to consider what questions have arisen as you've written memos and coded your data. What were questions you had at the beginning of the project? What are things that you're hoping to know more about as a result of running queries? I would encourage you to write a memo with all of the questions that you want to pose through queries, and also to write a memo for each query you run to talk about why you ran that query, what you learned from that query, and what further questions it's prompted you to investigate in your data. In the Qualitative Data Analysis with NVivo textbook, the authors talk about how queries are only as strong as the elements that go into them. The researcher had to have skill in coding, linking, and reflecting information on the project, the ability to ask solid questions, and the capacity to interpret and challenge the output. There are 8 types of queries in NVivo, and the Qualitative Data Analysis with NVivo text divides them into 3 subtypes. The first category of queries is word or phrase queries. These include text search and word frequency. As the names imply, these types of queries allow you to look at your project or specific elements of your project for particular words or phrases. The first query I'll demonstrate is a word frequency query. A word frequency query allows you to look at specific project elements for the most frequently used words. In this case, I want to look at the blog posts to see which words appear most frequently. To do this, I could click on each of the participants and choose all of their blog posts, but because I've created file classifications, I can click on blog to search through all the blogs at once. When I run the query, NVivo is showing me the words that appear most frequently. I can also look at these in a word cloud, a tree map, or a cluster analysis. This information may not be useful on its own, but I want to run a second word frequency query to compare the frequency in the blog posts with the frequency in the application materials. In this case, I notice some of the same words are appearing. I can also compare the word clouds between the 2 word frequency queries to see if there are any similarities or differences. In this case, I'm more intrigued by what the application materials are telling me, so I'm going to add this to my project. I've also created a folder under memos called queries, so that I can write a memo for each time that I run a query. The second type of word or phrase query is a text search query. In this query, instead of searching for the most frequently used words, I'm looking for specific words. In this case, I'm still interested in the blog posts. I remember a number of students using the word journey to describe their service journey, so I'm going to look for this word. I can see here that journey appears in a number of blog posts, and if I sort by folder, which is how I have my information organized, I can see all of the participants who use the word journey. This is somewhat useful, but it would be more useful if I was to look at the actual references. Now I can see that some people are using the word service journey, but they're also using this to describe an actual journey to a place. Seeing the individual word with a few words on either side is somewhat useful, but it might be more useful if I captured a little bit more context. You can see that I have a few more words on either side of the word journey, which is helpful in seeing how this was used. This is something I want to dig into more later, so I'm going to save the results in my project. And I want to create this as a new node or case, saved in my nodes. This has been created as a node, and now I can scroll down and see if I want to code for even more context in some cases by clicking on the reference, getting a sense of the text, and then coding that to the node. And I can see that that context has been added. I might find some references, in this case, to travel to a specific place, not related to their service journey necessarily. So I'm going to uncode that from this node. I wouldn't recommend adding the results of a query to your project without taking the time to critically go through the contents and make sure that the node makes sense to add to your project. But this can be useful if you think of a concept that you didn't notice initially but started to pop out as you went through more transcripts, and you don't want to go back and look for every reference, but you want to quickly scan the information and aggregate it into a node. For each query you run, be sure to create a memo to describe why you ran the query, what you learned from the query, and any next steps you might take as a result of the query. The next group of queries are theory-building queries. Theory-building queries can be particularly useful for allowing you to explore relationships among project items and helping you have a deep interpretation of the information in your project. A CROSSTAB query allows you to look at the codes in your project based on the classifications you created for your data. In the last project, you either set up a case classification where you were looking at information about a person or other unit of analysis, or a file classification where you were describing the different types of files in your project. As a reminder, when you set up a classification, you're looking first at the unit of analysis, then the attributes, and then the values associated with each of those attributes. In this project, I continue to be interested in the blog posts. Because my parent codes are aggregated from the children, I'm getting all of the information for the child codes by using the parent codes. I'm going to drag all of the parent codes into this section. You can also add codes by clicking on the plus sign. When I look at classifications, I can either use a file or case classification, and in this case, I'm interested in looking at what is coded by how participants identify their year in school. When I run the query, I can see the number of participants in each category and the number of participants who have information coded to each code. It's a little bit hard to see, but if I apply a color gradient, now I can see the darker areas are where more participants have information coded, and the white cells are where no information is coded. On its own, this may not be particularly useful, but I can double click on the number and be taken to the results of the CROSSTAB. A CROSSTAB query works really well to look at attribute values or to see the prevalence of a topic across participants or codes. If I wanted to look at this later, I could add this to my project and of course write a memo to describe what I learned from running this query. A matrix coding query is similar to a CROSSTAB. However, a matrix coding query gives you more flexibility in terms of the project elements you're exploring. In this case, I want to look at all of my codes. I want to look at information that's coded in blog posts. And instead of looking at participants by attribute, I want to look at the specific cases. Now I can see the number of references each participant has to each code. It's a little easier to see when I apply a gradient. And I can see that there's a density of codes about building relationships for all of the participants except 1 or 2, which is interesting. Perhaps I will run a second query, but this time looking at the specific references for the child codes for building relationships. Looking at this, I can see more about how the relationship codes are distributed between and among participants. This information is useful, and that it helps me develop more questions and more things that I want to drill down into my data and explore. A coding query is one of the more complex queries that you can run in NVivo. Whereas a matrix coding query or a CROSSTAB query allow you to look at information that includes 3 or 4 pieces of data in a cell, a coding query allows you to look at 5 or more pieces of information. In this particular project I've been using to demonstrate the videos, I don't necessarily have enough data coded to show a really good coding query. Some of the suggestions in the qualitative data analysis with NVivo textbook include looking for data that's coded at node A or B, but not node C, or perhaps digging deeper into some of the information that resulted from a CROSSTAB or matrix coding query, but that can't be answered by those queries. A compound query allows you to run 2 queries at once. In this example, I want to run a coding query where I'm looking at information coded to any of the codes or cases related to building relationships. I want to see if there's any intersection where something is coded to both building relationships and transitioning to a new city. So I'm also going to select any of the codes or cases under transitioning to a new city. When I run the query, NVivo is going to look for all of the text that's coded to both building relationships and transitioning to a new city. A compound query is useful in that you can look at either a text search or a coding query and its relationship to another text search or coding query to see if 2 things are coded to the same nodes, or if something is coded to one node and not another node, or if there are pieces of information in proximity to one another. The final group of queries are administrative queries. These may not seem as exciting, but they can be very useful for understanding the scope of your project. A coding comparison query allows you to look at how 2 people are coding information similarly or differently. I'm working in this project alone, so I'm not able to run this type of query, but if you are working in a project with another person, I would recommend using the coding comparison query to see how your coding aligns with your partner. The group query is only available in Windows. I won't demonstrate this query, but if you're interested, it can be useful to see how project items are associated with one another. The final element I'll demonstrate in this video are maps. The QSR website gives an overview of the 3 types of maps available in NVivo. A mind map allows you to brainstorm your ideas and visualize your thoughts. A concept map allows you to define concepts and think through their connections. And a project map allows you to display the items and links in your project. This semester, we've focused on data visuals using the Miles Huberman and Saldana text. In particular, in Analysis and Practice Projects 2 and 3, you had the opportunity to create visuals is an important component of analysis. Generating maps and models can help you visualize your data. You can use maps at the beginning of a project to outline your conceptual framework or create expected codes and connections. Throughout the analysis process to diagram connections or merging ideas, or in the reporting stages to create a visual to share with others which shows categories, themes, theories, or other findings. Similar to queries, for maps you should always write a memo that provides a narrative and describes how the map or model enhances your analysis and leads to a deeper understanding of the project. A mind map is the most basic kind of map you can create in NVivo. Mind maps allow you to take a primary concept, which may be a main idea for your study, and branch off with related ideas. After you've established the central idea of your mind map, you can branch off with sibling ideas. Once you've added sibling ideas, you can also add child ideas. In my example, the primary idea is transition, and I've added a layer of sibling ideas and also a layer of child ideas. You can use features like different colors or fonts to distinguish between the layers. You can also use the layout feature to visualize your ideas in different ways. If you have an idea that's related but not necessarily connected, you can add a floating idea. Once I've completed my mind map, it's saved as part of my project, and I can also export it as a visual. If I was at the beginning of my project and I thought I had created something that looked like a node structure, I could also create all of the ideas here as nodes or cases. In this case, I want to make them nodes. Now when I go to my nodes, I can see transition with all of the child nodes. This could be useful at the beginning of a project if I created what I thought was going to be my coding structure and I wanted to easily turn this into nodes, as long as I remembered to go back and add a description to each node. I also want to create a memo called mind map and use this memo to describe what I created, why I created it, and how it's useful in analyzing my data. In the video for Project 2, I introduced a project map as a way to organize your nodes after first cycle coding. A concept map is a useful tool in NVivo because it has a lot of flexibility. You can add shapes and then add text. You can use different shapes to represent different project elements or ideas. You can also add project elements, including files, nodes, and cases, among others. This brief demonstration only scratches the surface of what you're able to do with the concept map. This would be a great tool for creating a network diagram, as described in the Miles Huberman and Saldana textbook. This can also be a useful tool to explore ideas, connections, and questions as they relate to different elements in your project. You can always come back to your map to create edits as your project evolves and grows. I want to point out that NVivo 12 has created some shortcuts for queries and visuals. By right-clicking on a file, I can go down to Query, and NVivo will create a word frequency query for this file. I could also select any of the files and ask NVivo to run a query where it shows me all of the nodes that are coded for this file. And I can see all of the nodes that are coded to this particular blog post. This is an example of a group query where I can see the file and then a visual of all of the nodes. In terms of visualizing, I can right-click on a file, and NVivo will give me options including creating a word cloud, NVivo offers the same options for nodes as it does for files. By right-clicking and going to Query, I can conduct a word frequency query within this node. I can also look for other nodes that are coded at this node to see where there's an intersection of information and get that connection map, which you can also find with a group query. Although I've pushed all of the buttons in NVivo to show you some of the capabilities of the software when it comes to analyzing your data, and I do encourage you to push all the buttons just to see what they do, I caution you against pushing all the buttons and drawing conclusions for your project based on things that you don't understand why you did them. Before you incorporate that into your findings, make sure you've written a clear memo that explains why you did what you did and how it contributes to your understanding of your project. My encouragement for Project 3 is to spend some time exploring NVivo to see what it does and how it can support your analysis, but recognize the limitation is that you have to ask a good question before you can really get information that supports your analysis. A chef who has spent time practicing their craft is able to take quality ingredients, consider the flavor profiles in combination with one another, and create something that transcends the initial ingredients. As we shift into the final stage of the course, I hope you will consider how your project has become greater than the sum of its parts. At the beginning of the semester, I said that my hope was you would increase your confidence and competence as it relates to qualitative data analysis. As you continue this process and work on future projects, I hope you will continue to become proficient at planning your project, collecting data, organizing your files, developing codes, coding, creating connections within your project, interpreting the information, writing analytic and reflective memos, asking questions of your data, creating visuals, and sharing your thoughts with others. All of these elements create a quality, qualitative research project. My goal in sharing this is to emphasize the idea of process over product, quality inputs, skill development, and reflection. These are the references for the textbooks that I mentioned in the video, and all pictures are free stock photos from pexels.com. This concludes the video for NVivo Analysis Project 3. Best wishes as you continue your qualitative data analysis projects.